When Sarah saw the Hell's Angel stranded on the empty street as the sun began to set, every instinct told her to keep walking. But something about his desperate struggle with the broken Harley made her stop and offer help instead. The next morning, a lawyer knocked on her door with papers that would change everything. Someone had anonymously paid off all her debts, her grandmother's medical bills, and given her enough money to transform her entire future. But how does a simple 20-minute act of kindness to a stranger turn into a life-changing miracle that seems too incredible to be real? The golden hour light stretched across the empty street, casting long shadows between the abandoned storefronts and flickering neon signs that buzzed with electrical promise. Sarah Martinez adjusted the strap of her worn canvas bag as she walked home from her shift at Mel's all-night diner, her worn sneakers silent against the cracked pavement. The smell of fried food and coffee still clung to her uniform, mixing with the distant scent of blooming jasmine from someone's overgrown garden, and the faint exhaust fumes that seemed to live permanently in the city's concrete pores. She'd been walking this route for 3 years now, ever since her car finally gave up its mechanical ghost in a cloud of white smoke and left her dependent on her own 2 feet and the kindness of public transportation that rarely showed up on time. Each step carried the weight of another impossibly long day. 8 hours serving coffee and plates to truckers and insomniacs at Mel's all-night diner, her feet aching in shoes that had walked too many miles on unforgiving linoleum. Then 4 hours hunched over medical textbooks under the harsh fluorescent lights of the community college library, her eyes burning as she tried to memorize anatomical diagrams and drug interactions, while her stomach growled its complaints about the single granola bar that had constituted dinner. The words blurred together, sometimes lateral collateral ligament, acetylcholine receptors, signs and symptoms of myocardial infarction medical terminology that represented her desperate grasp at a better future, one patient at a time. Her phone buzzed with another text from her younger brother Miguel, the sound cutting through her exhausted thoughts like a blade. Abuela's prescription is ready, but they want the money up front now. Insurance denied the claim again. Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, leaning against a streetlight pole that had been tagged with graffiti, declaring, "Hope lives here," in faded blue letters. She calculated numbers that never seemed to add up right, no matter how many times she rearranged them in her head. $347 for her grandmother's heart medication, rent due in 5 days, and exactly $93 in her checking account, after tonight's tips, mostly quarters and crumpled singles, left by customers who appreciated her smile, but couldn't afford generosity. The cruel arithmetic of survival had become her unwanted specialty, a relentless calculation of sacrifice and hope that demanded daily recalibration. Every dollar had a destination before it ever reached her hands: utilities, groceries, Miguel's school supplies, the slow accumulation toward textbooks she couldn't afford to buy new. She'd mastered the art of making a single bag of rice last a week, of finding protein in beans and eggs when meat became a luxury beyond reach, of studying by streetlight when the electricity got turned off for 3 days last winter. But it was the dreams that hurt the most. The acceptance letter she'd had to decline from the State University's nursing program, still folded in her jewelry box like a pressed flower from a garden she'd never get to visit. She'd been 22 when her parents died in that rain-slicked intersection, their sedan no match for a delivery truck running a red light. And suddenly she'd become Miguel's guardian, her grandmother's caretaker, the sole architect of everyone's survival. Her fiancé David had tried to understand at first, but love had its limits when faced with the reality of medical bills and teenage attitude, and an elderly woman who needed constant supervision. The sound hit her ears before she saw its source: a deep, mechanical coughing that spoke of metal parts grinding against each other in mechanical distress, the automotive equivalent of a chest cold that wouldn't clear. Around the corner, bathed in the amber light of the setting sun, a massive Harley Davidson sat silent and defeated beside the curb, its usual thunder reduced to mechanical whispers by something as simple as mechanical failure. Its engine caught the dying light, gleaming like polished metal, all polished steel and black leather, and the kind of raw power that commanded respect even when silent. But it was the silence itself that was most telling, the absence of the thunderous roar that these machines were born to make. Kneeling beside the motorcycle was a man whose leather vest bore the unmistakable insignia she'd seen on documentaries and late-night news reports: the Death's Head patch of the Hells Angels, worn like a badge of honor, across shoulders, broad enough to carry the weight of reputation and legend. His graying beard was streaked with silver that caught the streetlight, his work-worn fingers telling stories of countless repairs and endless highways. Despite everything her grandmother had taught her about avoiding strangers, especially ones wearing patches that announced their allegiance to organizations that lived outside the law, Sarah found herself slowing her pace rather than quickening it. Something in his methodical attention to the disabled machine reminded her of her grandfather's patient way with broken things. Before caution could overrule compassion, she found herself setting down her bag and speaking words that would change everything. "Sounds like your carburetor might be flooded," she said, her voice steadier than her racing heartbeat. Jake's hands guided hers to the carburetor with the patience of a teacher who understood that knowledge was a gift meant to be shared. "Feel that? The metal's still warm, which means it's been trying to turn over for a while. When they get this hot and frustrated, they flood themselves with fuel." Sarah's fingers found the problem: a sticky float valve that had been holding the floodgates open, drowning the engine in its own lifeblood. The work reminded her of the countless hours she'd spent in her grandfather's garage, learning that mechanical problems were just puzzles, waiting for the right combination of patience and understanding. "My abuelo always said that broken things call to people who know how to fix them," she murmured, using Jake's flashlight to peer deeper into the engine's polished steel secrets. As they worked, Jake's stories emerged slowly, each memory surfacing with reluctant honesty: 3 decades of riding with the Brotherhood, a daughter he hadn't spoken to in 5 years because of choices that seemed right at the time, but felt heavier with each passing mile. "Joined the club when I was 22 and angry at the world," he said, his tone heavy with miles traveled and bridges burned. "Thought the patch would make me somebody. Turns out, it just made me somebody different than who I started out to be." Sarah understood the impossible equation of regret, how decisions accumulated consequences, like compound interest on borrowed time. Her own life was a series of sacrifices that had led her here, dropping out of nursing school to care for her grandmother, working double shifts to keep the lights on, watching her dreams get smaller and more practical with each passing year. "You ever feel like you're living someone else's life?" Jake asked, as they tested the carburetor's response, his question lingering between them. Sarah's hands stilled on the wrench as the words hit closer to home than she'd expected. "Every day," she admitted, thinking about the acceptance letter to the nursing program she'd had to turn down, the wedding dress still hanging in her closet from an engagement that ended when her fiancé realized that loving her meant loving her responsibilities too. "I used to want to be a pediatric nurse, had this whole plan work with kids, maybe open a clinic in a neighborhood like this one. But life had other ideas." The sun had nearly disappeared behind the skyline, painting the street in shades of purple and gold that made even the broken windows look beautiful. Jake watched her work with growing admiration, seeing something in her careful movements that reminded him of his own daughter at that age, fearless and kind, willing to help strangers, despite every reason not to. "You know what's funny?" he said, his voice softer now. "I've been riding these streets for 30 years, and nobody's ever stopped to help. Most people cross to the other side when they see the patch." Sarah looked up from the engine, her brown eyes reflecting the streetlights that had begun to flicker on in the gathering dusk. "Maybe they just never learned that the patch doesn't tell you who someone really island. My grandmother always said, you judge people by what they do when nobody's watching, not by what they wear when everyone island." 20 minutes later, The Harley roared back to life with a sound like controlled thunder, its engine purring with mechanical satisfaction. Jake pulled a crumpled 20 from his wallet money. Sarah desperately needed for her grandmother's prescription. Money that could mean the difference between medication and going without. But as she looked at his weathered face in the motorcycle's headlight, her grandfather's words echoed in her memory. Mija, sometimes the richest thing you can do is give someone the gift of not owing you anything. She pushed the bill back toward him gently. Just help someone else when you get the chance, she said, not knowing that Jake had already memorized the name on her community college ID badge, not knowing that her simple act of kindness had planted a seed in soil that had been waiting 30 years for something beautiful to grow. Jake sat in the dim light of his garage workshop until 3 in the morning, Sarah's words reverberating through his consciousness, haunting him with forgotten melodies of decency. The concrete floor was stained with decades of oil and memories, surrounded by half-finished projects that told the story of a man who understood machines better than people. But tonight, the mechanical rhythm of his world had fundamentally changed. He pulled out his phone, fingers hesitating over numbers he hadn't called in years, contacts who owed him favors from a lifetime of brotherhood, loyalty, and shared secrets. Razor, it's Jake. Yeah, I know what time it, Island. Listen, I need you to make some calls. The network of leather and chrome that had defined his existence for 3 decades suddenly became something else entirely, a web of connections that could move mountains when properly motivated. Phone calls cascaded through the night, each conversation building unstoppable momentum towards something unprecedented in the history of the chapter. Tommy Bulldog Morrison, who owned a chain of auto repair shops across 3 states. Maria Santos, the club's lawyer, who'd kept half the brotherhood out of prison with her legal wizardry. Big Mike Patterson, whose construction company had government contracts that generated more money than most people saw in a lifetime. There's this woman, Jake found himself saying over and over, his words weighted by feelings he couldn't identify. She stopped to help when she didn't have to, fixed my bike with her own hands, and wouldn't take a dime. By dawn, Jake had Sarah's entire life spread across his kitchen table, fragments of struggle that painted a portrait of quiet heroism. Credit reports that resembled a diagnosis of financial illness, student loans from her abandoned nursing program, medical bills from her grandmother's heart condition, utilities hanging by threads thinner than hope. Her younger brother Miguel worked 2 jobs while finishing high school. Their parents lost in a car accident 3 years ago that had left Sarah as the sole guardian of everyone's dreams and obligations. The scope of her sacrifice became clear in black and white numbers that told a story of quiet heroism, lived one impossible choice at a time. Jesus, whispered Maria Santos as she reviewed the paperwork at 7 in the morning, her usually unshakable composure cracking slightly. This girl's been carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders. The plan that emerged was as complex as any operation the club had ever orchestrated. But instead of territories or revenge, the target was redemption. Anonymous shell companies were established, legal documents drafted with the precision of military strategy, bank transfers arranged through channels that would make the money untraceable but legitimate. Jake's own savings account money he'd accumulated from years of legitimate contracting work, savings that had felt meaningless until this moment, became the seed money for what felt like the first honest thing he'd done in decades. We do this right, he told the assembled brotherhood in the back room of Murphy's bar, his tone commanding the authority earned through years of leadership and respect. No publicity, no recognition, no strings attached, just one good deed that nobody can ever trace back to us. But Sarah Martinez had no idea that her kindness had set forces into motion that were reshaping her entire universe. She spent that Thursday evening in the same routine that had defined her life for 3 years, studying medical terminology at her grandmother's kitchen table. While Abuela watched telenovelas on their ancient television set, the sound turned down low, so Sarah could concentrate. The prescription bottles sat on the counter in neat rows, each label a reminder of their financial tightrope and how thin the line was between stability and catastrophe. Miguel came home from his dishwashing job at 11, his teenager's shoulders already bent under responsibilities that should have belonged to someone twice his age. "How much do we still owe on the utility bill?" he asked, counting wrinkled dollar bills with the careful attention of someone who'd learned that every penny mattered. Sarah looked up from her textbook, calculating numbers that never seemed to add up to enough. "Don't worry about it, mijo. I'll figure something out." But that night, as she lay awake listening to her grandmother's labored breathing in the next room, Sarah couldn't shake the memory of Jake's calloused palms moving with practiced precision, or the way his eyes had softened when she'd refused his money. The encounter had left an indelible mark, revealing possibilities she'd thought were forever beyond reach. Friday morning arrived, with a knock that Sarah almost didn't hear, over the shower running and Miguel reviewing his college applications. When she finally opened the door, still towel drying her hair, the last thing she expected was a man in a charcoal suit expensive enough to cost more than her annual rent. "Miss Martinez? My name is David Chen. I'm an attorney with Morrison, Santos and Associates. I have some documents that require your immediate attention." His briefcase was leather that whispered of money and legitimacy, his business card embossed with gold lettering that caught the morning light streaming through her grandmother's lace curtains. Sarah's first thought was that someone was suing them, that some bureaucratic mistake had finally caught up with their careful juggling act of survival. But the papers he spread across her grandmother's worn kitchen table told a different story entirely, one so impossible that Sarah had to read each line 3 times before the words began to make sense. Every debt listed in neat columns had been marked "paid in full" with yesterday's date. Her grandmother's medical bills, totaling $37,000 of accumulated cardiac care. Her own student loans from the nursing program she'd been forced to abandon. The back rent they'd been negotiating with their landlord for 8 months. Miguel's school fees, and the laptop fund she'd been saving toward since his sophomore year. "This has to be a mistake," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of her heart hammering against her ribs. "No mistake, Miss Martinez. Additionally, there's been a deposit made to your checking account in the amount of $50,000, with instructions that it's to be used for your education and any expenses related to returning to school." David Chen's professional demeanor softened slightly as he watched tears begin to stream down Sarah's face. "Your benefactor wished to remain anonymous, but asked me to convey a message that kindness is the only currency that multiplies when you give it away, and that sometimes guardian angels wear leather jackets instead of wings." The words hit Sarah like a physical force, and suddenly she was back on that Sunset Street, watching Jake's scarred hands work with surprising gentleness on his machine's metal sole. The $20 bill she'd refused, the way he'd memorized her face in the streetlight, the quiet dignity in his voice when he'd talked about regret and second chances. The biker, she breathed, understanding flooding through her in a rush of clarity. It was Jake. David Chen neither confirmed nor denied, simply smiled with the discretion of someone paid handsomely to keep certain secrets, gathered his papers with efficient movements, and disappeared back into the world of legitimate miracles and anonymous redemption. Sarah sank into her grandmother's armchair, the same chair where she'd calculated impossible equations of survival just yesterday morning, and felt her entire world reshaping itself around this moment of grace. Through the kitchen doorway, she could see Miguel reading the documents with wide-eyed amazement, and from the bedroom came the sound of her grandmother's delighted laughter as she realized what the papers meant for her prescriptions, her doctor visits, her future measured in heartbeats instead of dollar signs. But it was the acceptance letter. Sarah found herself Googling the nursing program at the state university, the pediatric specialization she'd dreamed about since she was Miguel's age, the clinic she'd imagined opening in neighborhoods exactly like this one. That evening, As the sun set over the same street where her life had changed forever, Sarah walked slowly past the spot where Jake's Harley had sat broken and defeated just 24 hours ago. The pavement looked different now, transformed from mere concrete into something more like holy ground, where strangers had become angels and kindness had multiplied beyond all reasonable mathematics. She pulled out her phone and typed a text to the nursing program director. "I'd like to reapply for admission to the fall semester." Then she looked up at the sky, painted in shades of gold and possibility, and whispered a thank you to the universe for broken-down motorcycles, leather-clad angels, and the revolutionary power of refusing $20 bills when your heart tells you that some gifts are worth infinitely more than money. Somewhere in the distance, she could swear she heard the rumble of a Harley-Davidson carrying its rider toward the next intersection where grace might be needed, one small act of courage at a time.